Whether in a tutorial of mine or while chatting over a cup of coffee, when students have had occasion to lament some aspect of their educational or social experience, to decry something they would rather be otherwise, but felt powerless to change, such students have often heard me utter a certain refrain: "Blessed are the organized." I am now in the fortunate position of having proudly to confess that I stole this refrain from Professor Jeffrey Stout, our esteemed guest lecturer this evening, and truly, among so many other things, the author of the 2010 book, Blessed Are the Organized, Grassroots Democracy in America, which presents an eyewitness account of simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary people doing the work of realizing democratic ideals in actual praxis. Also the author of Ethics After Babel and Democracy and Tradition, Professor Stout, who hails from Trenton, New Jersey, is a professor emeritus of religion at Princeton University, where he also completed his doctoral studies after his undergraduate years at Brown University, during which he found time, and I would like all my students to hear this, to chair a student strike, run the Rhode Island Draft Information Center, and to found Issues, a journal of opinion. At Princeton, he chaired the religion department, and, unsurprising given his strong commitment to praxis, he received awards for teaching and mentoring. He has also served as a trustee of Princeton University Press and the Journal of Religious Ethics. He served as president of the American Academy of Religion in 2007 and was selected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2008. In 2017, Professor Stout was also selected to give the prestigious Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh, where he discussed the political implications of ancient, medieval, and modern conceptions of religion. However, and perhaps closest to my heart, is the fact that he once served as trustee of the mighty Anthology Film Archives, a second, occasionally maybe a first home to me during my studies. As long as I have known him, and certainly far longer, his interest in and commitment to film is characteristically contemplative and activistic. And I look forward to reading the book he is finishing on the cinematic sacred, which will consider films by Brakhage, Capra, Dorsky, Hitchcock, Markopoulos, and Ozu, among others. I hear tell that he's also beginning a skeptical study of the idea of the common secular standpoint for public reasoning. But tonight, Professor Stout will be delivering a lecture that literally only he could, even in our midst, a close reading of Alfred Hitchcock's Shadow of Doubt. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jeffrey Stout.
Well, thank you for those exceedingly generous words. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm especially grateful to Ron for suggesting my name to the selection committee, and to Veronica Tucker for making the arrangements, and to Thomas in the back there for helping with the technical details. My topic this evening is, as you can tell, Shadow of a Doubt, a film Alfred Hitchcock described many times as either his best or his favorite. Now, my aim is to read this film with the attentive respect we often reserve for great books. For anyone hoping to learn what reading a motion picture entails, by way of rigor and delight, there is no more instructive and I'll say seductive place to begin than with this intricately layered film. I would call it a Russian doll if all the nested meanings were harmonious all the way down. But in this case, we have something more like a suitcase with a multi-layered false bottom. With most directors, a careful unpacking of nested meanings wouldn't take us very far. But Hitchcock is an artist whose attention to detail and delight in irony, allusion, and symbolism always leads somewhere interesting. If at some point in this lecture you think I have unpacked meanings that aren't there, think back to this cameo, which see Hitchcock there where the arrow is pointing. That's Hitchcock's trademark cameo. Most of his films have one. In this case, he's holding all the cards, and he's telling us he's holding all the cards, that he's in complete control of every detail, every line, every element in every image shown in the film. Now let's start out with some chronology. Alfred Hitchcock was born to Roman Catholic parents near London. He attended convent schools and secondary schools run by the Salesians and the Jesuits. After spending some initial time in the British film industry and then in the German film industry, he returned to Britain and became the most prominent director in England, known as the Master of Suspense. In the summer of 1939, he accepted an offer to move to Hollywood. Now, the timing here is important because just a little later, Germany invaded Poland, and the United Kingdom and France declared war. A bit later, we have the German bombardment of England, and it's important to keep in mind in the remainder of this lecture that Hitchcock's family was there experiencing the bombardment. Now pay attention to these dates, if you will. 1941, in December, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and the next day the US declares war, and then a few days later declares war against Germany. So notice the relation among the dates. In the summer of 1942, Shadow of a Doubt is shot mainly on location because of the approaching, or because of the war conditions. It was shot more on location than would ordinarily have been the case. Hitchcock saw this as an opportunity actually to make the film more authentically located somewhere. So there's less reliance on stage sets than would have been the case in his previous films. Now, immediately after the film was shot that summer, largely in Santa Rosa, there are a few shots early in the film that are supposedly in Philadelphia, but they were actually shot in Newark, New Jersey. In September, so immediately following the shooting, Emma Hitchcock, Hitchcock's mother, and I want to emphasize the name Emma, she dies in England. She was ill throughout the shooting of the film. And in the following January, Shadow is released, and the New York Times reviewer said that the film did a great job of causing goosebumps, that Hitchcock was in his usual form as a master of suspense, but he found the reviewer found the moral of the film antisocial, or at best obscure. So, little more than 2 years later, Germany surrenders, the war is over, and right in that period, Hitchcock is flown to England to advise the British military on how to piece together a documentary based on footage filmed by soldiers who were liberating the concentration camps. And one thing we can talk about in the Q&A is what advice Hitchcock gave to those documentarians and why. This is the footage. 5 of the 6 reels of the footage were later put together in a PBS documentary that was finally shown in 1984, I think it was. So now, characters and settings. For those of you who haven't seen the film, the villain, Charles Oakley, is a shadowy but dashing man of wealth. 2 detectives are searching for him. Actually, the film is famous for having many pairs of 2s. There are 2 detectives. There are 2 pairs of detectives. There are 2 Charlies. There are 2, keep on going, it would go into the 20s. So the 2 detectives are searching for him on the East Coast. This is what supposedly is occurring in Philadelphia. And realizing that he's being followed and that he's a suspect for a crime, Charles Oakley flees Philadelphia to take refuge in suburban Santa Rosa, where his adoring sister Emma, lives with her family, the Newtons. Emma's eldest child, young Charlie, is enchanted by her uncle. They are both called Charlie and linked to one another in various ways, some of them disturbing. She is disenchanted with her family's way of life and desperate to escape the future that has been scripted for her. Emma's husband, Joseph, is a bank clerk who loves crime stories. Their younger daughter, Anne, is reading Ivanhoe. She's into romance and Gothic. Her brother, Roger, is into numbers. Now, in the first dinner scene, Roger says that photos of his grandparents were taken in 1888, 53 years ago, meaning that the story is set in 1941. Given that there are several references to newspapers, but none to Pearl Harbor and none to a declaration of war, we can infer that the film is set before December 7th. And if you know anything about the climate in Santa Rosa, it's pretty clear that it's set in the summer. Okay. Most people know Hitchcock primarily as the master of suspense, but film scholars consider him far more than that. In a book that declared Hitchcock quite simply the single most important director in the history of cinema, Richard Allen, who is the editor of the Hitchcock Annual, described Shadow of a Doubt as one of Hitchcock's most profound films. Now that the notion of profundity suggests depth. We're back to the layers of meaning that I referred to earlier. David Cook, in his widely used textbook, A History of Narrative Film, which is now in at least its 5th edition, refers to Hitchcock as one of the leading figures in film history and to Shadow of a Doubt as an undisputed masterwork. These scholars differ, however, in how they read Hitchcock, in particular on what they take his artistic outlook to be. For Allen, Hitchcock was neither moral nor immoral, but amoral, first and last an aesthete. And Cook, by contrast, refers to Hitchcock as a moralist, and he refers in this connection to his similarities to Kafka, whom some of you have just read, and Arendt. In particular, the Arendt connection being that Hitchcock is intent on unmasking the banality of evil. So no one doubts that Hitchcock was an artist devoted to fashioning a style, which reminds us repeatedly of its personal, perspectival, essentially interpretive character. In this sense, he was certainly an aesthete. But what kind of aesthete was he? An amoral aesthete? A moral one? What is at the bottom of the suitcase? The French critics who first elevated Hitchcock's reputation as an artist wondered how much his Roman Catholic upbringing had shaped his work. Was he essentially a Catholic moralist and social critic, like the great French filmmaker Robert Bresson, who, by the way, deeply admired Pascal? And when François Truffaut posed the question about the connection to Roman Catholicism to Hitchcock in I think it was a 20-hour interview, Hitchcock went off the record when he gave his response. So we don't know what Hitchcock's response was, and it's curious to think of why he thought it prudent to go off the record. Well, the French critics did very little to clarify the Catholic connection, but they suspected that it was there. As Slavoj Žižek has noted, subsequent film scholarship has mostly played down Hitchcock's Roman Catholic background. P. Adams Sidney's brief 2003 essay on vertigo is an exception. You'll remember Professor Sidney from his lecture here in February. He is my dear friend, my mentor in cinema studies, and the president of the Ron Wilson Admiration Society, for which I serve as recording secretary. In the Vertigo essay, Sidney argues that many of Hitchcock's American films introduce Roman Catholic or biblical elements, often while hinting that the protagonists go wrong through blindness to the sacraments or by turning a deaf ear to citations of scripture around them. Some of his films even imply, according to Sidney, that film-going and filmmaking themselves arise from a propensity to sin, to view and identify with acts of sex and violence at the price of moral blindness. That's a quotation from Sidney. He suggests that The Wrong Man is Hitchcock's film about a miraculous conversion, a gift of divine grace, whereas in Vertigo, the subject of the essay, the protagonist is disillusioned shortly after turning away from the sanctuary and ascending a bell tower. So I take it that Sidney is making a strong preliminary case for reading Hitchcock as a Catholic moralist. So let's now turn to Shadow of a Doubt with these approaches in mind, beginning with the title. The film's title obviously employs the word shadow, and shadows figure heavily throughout the film, as they often do in vampire movies, such as Murnau's Nosferatu of 1922, and Gothic thrillers, such as Hitchcock's first Hollywood film, Rebecca, of 1940. So is Hitchcock doing anything novel with this conventional late romantic motif? Is there an allusion in the title, Shadow of a Doubt? St. Augustine's Confessions is a book equally prized by Roman Catholics and Protestants. It is a book of turns. Its shadows are created by a will turned away from God, the source of light. What you see and what you don't see is determined by that to which your will is turned. Moral blindness is thus an effect of sin. All of these themes cohere with the details of Shadow of a Doubt. Young Charlie doesn't want to see the evil staring her in the face, and when she is finally forced to reckon with it, she is condemned to embrace the bourgeois conformity she quite reasonably found utterly distasteful early in the film. It isn't a happy ending. Charlie is transformed, all right, but she isn't saved. A conclusion consistent with reading the story as a failed conversion, but also perhaps with reading it as an aesthete's tale of conformism, decadence, and demoralization. These are actual quotations from the Confessions down at the bottom. Two other possible allusions are worth considering. In Carl Jung's Psychology and Religion, a book that was published in 1938, is the product of lectures he gave at Yale. In that book, the shadow is Jung's name for the psyche's dark archetype. Jung had a rather sketchy relationship to Nazism in the early 30s. By the time he gets to the late 30s, he's trying to psychoanalyze the Nazi movement, and the notion of the shadow is one of the key elements in his diagnosis. So it is repression of the shadow, your dark side, according to Jung, that releases horrendous evil into the world. That the film depicts horrendous evil is obvious, given that the villain, Uncle Charlie, is a serial murderer, but he doesn't repress awareness of his darker side. He identifies with it and sometimes expresses this with breathtaking openness. If we focus solely on Uncle Charlie, Jung seems to be a dead end. But unlike her uncle, young Charlie spends 2/3 of the film repressing her sense that he is evil. Equally important, the Santa Rosa community remains blithely unaware of his true character, even at the end of the film. And why is that? Young Charlie has kept silent about the horrors her uncle has perpetrated. That's why the broader community doesn't know. If Hitchcock is alluding to Jung, he might be saying something about the effects of repressing awareness of evil, the social effects as well as the personal effects. So hold that thought. In Plato's Republic, shadows are illusory images projected onto a wall and mistaken for reality by the prisoners dwelling in a cave. base pleasures of the lowest sort of soul are idols of true pleasure. The arts are placed in question, and finally in Book 10, it's suggested that the dramatic arts, in particular, are to be banned from the ideal city, whereas hymns and, of course, philosophical dialogues, even though they may have artistic elements, are not. Now notice that all three of these possible allusions in the title cohere with Sidney's approach to vertigo. During the first dinner scene, a bottle of wine is brought to the table at Uncle Charlie's request. "Take a little wine for thy stomach's sake," he says, as Roger hands him the wine. The verse comes from the 5th chapter of 1 Timothy, which, as Sidney points out, is mainly about the treatment of widows. Hardly a coincidence in a film about a murderer of merry widows. So verse 23 is the one Uncle Charlie quotes. Sidney has drawn our attention, I take it, to verses 3, 6, and 11 through 15. Now, I'll return to the intervening verses, the ones between from 16 to 22 a little later, but we should be putting a pin in that interval for now, a pin between verses 15 and 23. These are verses that Sidney doesn't discuss, but which will be relevant to my reading of the film. So far, I have consulted a convention of Gothic cinema, allowed for allusions, and begun investigating a verse. Now let me ask you what you see here. Hitchcock made use of Freud throughout his career when constructing plots, making jokes, and hinting at perversities. Most American and European directors of Hitchcock's era did the same, albeit less elegantly. Hollywood censorship gave all filmmakers reasons to disguise what they were saying about controversial subjects, such as sexuality, politics, and religion. Freud provided a means of doing this, a code, if you will, but also an outlook adopted by many of the intellectuals and artists who lived in major cities. Sophisticated urban audiences assumed that if anything in a Hollywood movie could be interpreted in Freudian terms, it was probably meant to be. In other words, follow the phallus. Freud was himself a debunker of religion and a hero to many secular aesthetes. So does Hitchcock's extensive use of Freudian imagery lend support to Richard Allen's conclusions? Sidney would argue that the imagery needs to be read closely before we decide what Hitchcock was doing with it. Uncle Charlie is a dandy and a shadowy serial killer, a perverse, uncaring aesthete. Is the film's perspective on him amoral or moral, religious or secular? And what role, if any, do Freudian symbols play in conveying this? Well, in our first clip, we find Uncle Charlie in Philadelphia. And I'll just point out before running the clip that the if you can't see it, the number on the doorway of the boarding house is 13, a number associated in folklore with bad luck, but also a number associated in the Bible with Judas and with the Antichrist. So Charles is fondling his phallic cigar, and he's in the pose of a vampire, according to the convention of vampire movies. There's money strewn on the table and floor next to him, and in comes the keeper of the house.
I hate to bother you, but I thought you'd like to know there were two men here. Two men asking for you. A young man and a
So she's referring to the detectives,
They were sorry you wasn't
wondering, she
I
doesn't
said you
know they're detectives, but they're two people searching for him.
Exactly, but I think they will.
He's taking
Just now,
this
when I had
in,
to get off the store, I seen them standing.
and let's skip ahead. She's concerned about all this money lying around.
Those friends of yours told me not to mention they'd called. Wanted to surprise you. But I thought you'd like to know somehow.
Yes, yes, of course. If they come back, you may show them in.
Yes.
And she goes
You know,
over
Mrs.
to,
Martin, it's very...
Husband's wife?
We'll be looking.
did you get that? You almost forget you're you. You're your husband's wife. A remarkable thing. But several things about this clip. First, you see Mrs. Potter announce that she's going to be on the train that will also be carrying, we now know, be carrying Uncle Charlie out of town. Okay. Second, the unusual character of the sibling relationship, the degree of disturbance the departure of Charles causes for Emma. So what happened back when a younger Emma cared for her brother after his first bike ride resulted in an accident that left him bedridden for months? This question is all the more disturbing when we recall that Emma is also the name of Hitchcock's mother. What is he saying about her? Earlier in the film, there is a hint that the head injury Charles sustained in the bike accident marks the moment at which he turned into his present self. But one's first bike ride is a stock Freudian symbol for loss of virginity. What did Charles and Emma do? How exactly did she care for him? Young Charlie had previously expressed despair at the thought of having to assume the role of a wife in this cultural system, and now her mother is expressing despair at the prospect of returning to her normalized role when Charles departs. Young Charlie shows up at the train station in widow's black. Next to Roger's elbow in this scene, the sign says "Safety First." Uncle Charlie's cane points directly at Emma's mouth. "Come on, Charlie, you can see me get off." Somehow both Charlies, Anne and Roger, end up on the train as it pulls out of Santa Rosa. Crucially, Mrs. Potter is there too. We see her waving. But young Charlie's back is turned at that moment. With the train now at full speed, young Charlie resists her uncle's attempt to kill her. They are struggling, but the movements and speech resemble intercourse. "Not yet, Charlie. Let it get a little faster, just a little faster. Faster, now." we hear the Merry Widow waltz. He slips, and she pushes him to his death on the tracks. The film ends with Graham and young Charlie conversing about evil on the steps of the church. While we overhear the minister's effusive eulogy for Uncle Charlie, only these two standing outside the church know the full story about him. He thought the world was a horrible place, says Charlie. Well, it's not quite as bad as that, says Graham, but sometimes it needs a lot of watching. Seems to go a little crazy now and then, like Uncle Charlie. This is the scene that the New York Times reviewer took to be the film's Aesopian moral, which he lamented had enough bathos to knock you down. I take it to be a false moral, not the actual moral. Whose evil have we been watching here, and who has the eyes to see it? The answer to the first question cannot simply be Uncle Charlie if the answer to the second question is relevant. The typical American family is nice. This one is a sty. The murderous uncle's character was shaped in suburban America, where his sister Emma cared for him as an injured boy. The caring seems to have involved her mouth and his phallus, a disturbing thought, but also one that alters our overtly judgmental view of him. Now young Charlie and her younger sister have been drawn into the slime, learning all the while to repress their awareness of what is going on around them, as victims of sexual abuse often unconsciously do. Hitchcock is smuggling a critique of American conformity past the censors in a false-bottomed suitcase. His critical target is the ethos of normality to which young Charlie conforms when she doesn't spill the beans on her uncle. Hitchcock expects many of his viewers to be blind in roughly the way young Charlie is. He has shown her lying. She is pretty and naive, so we look past her lies. He has enticed us into rooting for her. Perhaps we miss that she is trying to get Uncle Charlie to board a train that will also carry his next likely victim. Mrs. Potter told us so just after Charles announced his departure. Have we noticed that young Charlie fails to take in the significance of Mrs. Potter's presence on the train? When has our heroine given a single conscious thought to her uncle's potential victims? Not since protesting her uncle's nihilistic dismissal of their sacred value. Hitchcock believes that his American viewers, like Uncle Charlie, mainly care about being nice and keeping their mothers happy. We don't want to discover that Santa Rosa is no less fallen than Philadelphia, that young Charlie's blindness is our blindness, nor that the two Charlies are spiritual twins. They are both deeply sinful, a murderer and the nice, enabling, lying niece who kills him. But once we realize how traumatically broken their childhoods have been, we can sympathize with them too. The moral perspective of the movie is not black and white. Sinfulness is ubiquitous, personal, domestic, and societal. And the director has confessed it too. It is time to return to the reference to 1 Timothy 5 in the second dinner scene. And as Sidney has pointed out, that chapter of Paul's letter is mainly about the proper treatment of widows. But what does it say? We've already looked at some verses, but there's one more from chapter 5 that appears to bear on the significance of shadow of a doubt. verse 20, which teaches that sin must be rebuked so that others also may fear. This could have been the film's epigraph if Hitchcock were less subtle. I would think the true moral of the film, not the phony one that's put at the end of the movie. Once young Charlie realizes that her uncle is indeed a murderer, she refrains from publicly rebuking him. This is her mortal sin of omission. She does not warn others that there is reason to fear him. Her main objective, which teaches us something about the structure of her loves, what she really cares about, is to protect her mother from the truth about Uncle Charlie and to protect her family from the dishonor and embarrassment of having him, the shame of having him arrested in Santa Rosa. The family's honor and surface tranquility must be preserved at all costs. An Augustinian critique of this social world would go as follows. Young Charlie's way of caring about surface tranquility, about niceness, is what corrupts her life. It casts the shadow that causes her blindness. It is why she does not see the danger in which she is placing Mrs. Potter and others like her. For Augustinians, what you care about most, what you love most, is the essence of your character, the determinant of what you can perceive, infer, and do. Conformity to the world is rooted in disordered caring. Disordered love makes the world go dark. Freud is helpful in explaining the consequences and the connections with perversity, but the root of the darkness goes deeper than Freud can fathom. If there is a single key to unlocking the meaning of Shadow of a Doubt, verse 20 of 1 Timothy chapter 5 is where it is hidden. But what lock is this key meant to open, besides what I've said so far? Is Hitchcock addressing an issue of the day or simply expressing a timeless point about sinfulness? Hitchcock has made a film during an eventful year for horrendous evil in Europe. If this is a Catholic's film about a Protestant bourgeoisie of nice liars, merry widows, incestuous matrons, bankers without conscience, and ministers without prophecy, who hope you'll forget they're here. It is also an Englishman's film about America's tardiness in joining the war. Recall that the story is set in the months immediately preceding Pearl Harbor in 1941. Once we focus on this, our attention is drawn to the many American soldiers we see in the film. They appear during the date sequence, which centers on lying, during young Charlie's 2 dashes through town, both of which involve jaywalking, by the way, and when Graham tells Anne to tell the Dracula story. Soldiers are also much in evidence during the bar scene in Till 2. We see 3 soldiers just before the Charlies enter the bar. During their tense exchange there, a soldier repeatedly leans out of a booth, eventually gets up to let someone out of the booth, and then returns to his seat. As the soldier rises, and that's what we see in this still, Charles says, anyone can see that. When the 2 Charles are shot in profile, they frame the soldier. Throughout Uncle Charlie's nihilistic speech about sleepwalking and blindness, the soldier is made visible to us. When young Charlie leaves the bar, she has to make her way past 3 more soldiers who are on their way in. I take it that Hitchcock is asking why all these soldiers are here in Santa Rosa. Why are they hanging out in bars, diverting themselves, when Jews are being exterminated? Much of Europe is under Nazi rule. Britain's fate remains uncertain, and Hitchcock's mother and other family members remain in danger. The soldiers are here because the American public cares about what young Charlie cares about, and is blind, even while watching this movie, to her blindness and complicity, and to the ways in which abuse, perversity, and corruption spread contagiously through the generations. We seem to have before us a film that is anything but an exercise in amoral aestheticism. A film that is about the failure of the American business elite, the American church, and the average American family to recognize and respond appropriately to horrendous evils in the world. A film in which the exclamation, "but they're human beings," affirms the victims of such horrors, however fallen they may be, as nonetheless worthy of reverent protection and mourning. A film in which the tendency of nice, ordinary people to exhibit merely inert concern for the victims of horrendous evil condemns them to abuse and death. A film charging the audience with blinding itself to the heroine's blindness, and with complicity in the horrors its government has been unwilling to face and prevent. A film implying that popular entertainment of the very sort this film pretends to be is, in Augustinian terms, merely a diverting distraction from the most important things, or, in Platonic terms, nothing more than moving shadows. A film alleging that the American public's ultimate and therefore ultimately corrupting concern is to maintain its delusions of domestic purity and tranquility. A film intent on laying bare the motives and consequences of failing to rebuke evil publicly so that others too may fear it. In short, a film no less timely now than when it was first released. I thank you very much.